days the embankment was down here, just a grassy embankment. The protesters came over the bank to the left of the post, and I was standing down here just beside where the red sign would be on the fence, looking out over the field.
This is where I was standing approximately that Saturday in July 40 years ago at the Waikato Springbok game. There'd been a long build-up to this game and the tour itself, more than 6 months of protests all around the country, and they were led by an organisation called HART, Halt All Racist Tours, but all sorts of people had been involved. The mainline churches, lots of community groups, quite a few Maori organisations as well, particularly here in the Waikato, had all been protesting the tour and calling for the government and or the rugby union to call the tour off.
At the time, I was 16 years old and an avid rugby supporter, supporting Waikato, the local team, who in 1981 were the Ranfurly Shield holders and one of the premier teams, provincial teams in New Zealand. So I attended the game, paid my $4 for my standing room only ticket with my mate Steve, and we were all set for a great game of rugby, because in 1956 the Waikato had beaten the Springboks and we were hoping for a repeat.
The protesters marched from Garden Place to Tristram Street to the stadium here, and I was a few minutes late, so I arrived here at the stadium just after the small group of people, only several hundred, had broken through the fence and had gone onto the ground. And by the time I arrived, a police line was forming between the rugby supporters who were on the mound watching the game and the protesters who were in Tristram Street. And we were just standing there wondering what was going on inside the ground. We didn't know. Some of us had radios, and so they were relaying to the group what was happening inside the ground, but mostly we were unaware of what was happening on the actual rugby ground.
Okay, we didn't see any protesters on the way to the ground, and we didn't really see any until there was a big commotion over to our left, and a bunch of people poured through the crowd and out onto the field, which upset us a bit because it was getting in the way of our rugby game. And so when the police came out, we were pretty excited about that. We thought the police would easily brush these protesters away and they would get on with the game. Never once imagined that the game would be called off. So it was the first time we'd seen riot police, and that was pretty exciting too, with shields. Oh, no, they didn't have shields, they had helmets and batons and things, and yeah, we thought that was, protesters were finished as soon as they came out, but didn't quite work out that way. I do remember one guy coming up beside me on the fence and pulled out this big knife, about yay size, and said, "Oh, I'm going up at court on Monday, may as well be hung for a sheep as for a lamb. I'm going to kill me a protester." And he jumped over the fence and started to run towards the crowd in the middle, and the police saw him within about 10 metres, and about 5 guys jumped on him and carted him away. So I imagine he did appear in court on Monday after all.
After a while, a group of us protesters came down to this side of the ground, to Rugby Park, and this was where a lot of farmers had loaned their cattle trucks to provide a barrier between Rugby Park and the ground itself. And so all these cattle trucks were lined up in a row along here. And so quite a few of us protesters started trying to push these cattle trucks out of the way. And so we would break the valves off the tyres to let the tyres down. I helped do a few of those, and we'd climb up on the trucks to avoid the police when occasional columns of riot police would come along, and a group of us tried to push one of the trailers out of the way so we could break through.
I remember there was a bit of tension, and when smoke and gas started drifting across the field, we weren't quite sure what that was, and yeah, it was a bit of sort of fear about what was going on, but and as it went on and they didn't manage to get them off, we were starting to get a bit worried about watching the rugby, and till finally when they announced the game was off, and we hung around for probably half an hour before walking home.
When we heard the game had been called off, the protesters in Tristram Street all gathered together and started to march back to Garden Place. And as we were marching along, there was quite a big group of us, of course. As we were marching along, we could see the rugby supporters streaming out of the stadium on the other side, and we could sense the anger. And so we marched as quickly as we could towards Garden Place. And there were people with loud hailers saying, "Strong men to the back" of the protest. And I saw quite a few people who had blood noses from rugby supporters punching the protesters. Fortunately, I was able to just walk down a side street, and I went straight home and didn't go all the way back to Garden Place. But I heard later that there was quite a lot of violence happened on the way back to Garden Place and in the centre of the city. And so Lindsay and I didn't actually meet up until we both got home quite a while after the game had been called off. The Waikato Museum is holding an exhibition to commemorate the 40th anniversary.
So it's quite interesting looking at these photos because they show an aspect of the day that the Waikato game that I never saw because I was at the game. These are photos mainly taken from the point of view of the protesters. And I see people here that I knew back then in these protests. Mum gave us a good talking to after the game that night, and I remember her saying that, well, at least I was there because I was interested in rugby, but she thought Bryce was just there to stir.
When Lindsay and I got home, Mum had a chat to us both, and I don't think her assessment was fair that I was just there to stir. I was very committed to opposing apartheid, and yes, I was only 18, but I had learned about it at school and was well aware of how dreadful apartheid was and that the tour shouldn't go ahead as a support of apartheid. The following day, Lindsay and I both went to church with our family, as we did every Sunday. And after the service in the foyer, one of the youth group leaders punched me in the face because he was so angry that I was a protester and had contributed to calling off the game. And I became known as Rebel from then on. And that name stayed with me for 10 years until I left the country. A few weeks later, after the game at Eden Park had been disrupted by a light plane dropping flower bombs on the pitch, the pastor at church was preaching, and he had been a missionary in South America for several years, and he was talking approvingly of how in South America a light plane would have been shot down long before it reached the rugby ground and was able to disrupt the game.
Today, I believe that I was completely on the wrong side of history back then, and but I also believe that the rugby union and the government were right to hold the tour, but for the wrong reasons, and I believe that the protesters were right to protest, but also for the wrong reasons. If the tour had been called off, as the protesters wanted, that would have had the effect, or had very little effect in South Africa, because it was no different from any other tour that had been called off, or every other sporting contact that had been called off, which were done by governments and by organisational bodies. But having the tour go ahead in New Zealand with the South African national rugby team, which many South Africans were obsessed with, and watching it tour New Zealand and seeing the protests of the common people and common white people of New Zealand protesting about South Africa's apartheid regime, that had some impact. And for that reason, I consider that the tour, in spite of its negative and divisive impact on New Zealand, it had an overall historically good impact on South Africa.
I agree, actually, about the cost to New Zealand of the divisiveness. I didn't think the government, for example, deserved to win the election later that year, but they won that on law and order issues. And the division in New Zealand society did stay for quite a while, but yes, it certainly had an enormous impact on South Africa. And
as we saw earlier in the footage, Nelson Mandela, when he heard that the game in Hamilton had been called off, he said it was as if the sun came out in their jail cells. The impact in South Africa was enormous, and I think in hindsight was well worth it. I was thrilled to watch what happened in South Africa over the 80s and into the 90s as they dismantled apartheid. I was particularly impressed when they set up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission under Archbishop Desmond Tutu. I thought that was an amazingly Christian way to deal with the damage that they had done to their society and to try and forgive and to move on from that.